Hello, everyone, and welcome to our second session of the day, Worker Wellbeing and the Gig Economy. My name is Emma Bisco. I am a Learning and Development Coordinator with the Work Wellness Institute, and I will be opening and closing all of your sessions today, so you will be seeing my face around. Before I begin, I would like to draw your attention to the accessibility button on the top right-hand corner of your screen. It's just to the left of the notification bell. Please use this feature to ensure FeedLoop is optimized to you and your needs. And if you'd like to enable captions, please press the live CC transcript, which should be right below my face here. If you're experiencing any technical difficulties whatsoever, please use the orange chat box on the bottom left-hand corner, and a member of our team will be with you to help you out. I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the 3 historic nations and the unceded lands that I reside and work upon. This land holds a special spiritual and cultural connection for the local First Nations in Metro Vancouver. The Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam nations, all of which are a part of a larger group called Coast Salish. I'd also like to take the time to thank our speakers, our funders, all of our partners, and all of you here today to make this conference possible. Before I hand it over to our wonderful panelists, who I may add are also collaborators on our WWI Gig Work Research Project, I have a few additional housekeeping points for the session. We ask that everyone remains muted throughout the presentation, and we encourage you to use the live chat that you see on your FeedLoop screen to submit questions and any comments that you may have. We'll be collecting these questions submitted through the FeedLoop chat and followed up with a question and answer at the end of the session. If you'd like to follow along the slides, you can find them below this presentation on FeedLoop under Files. For the best viewing experience, we do recommend full screen. To moderate this panel, we are so pleased to welcome Steve Mantis. Steve Mantis is a Canadian advocate for injured workers and people with disabilities, best known for years of volunteer efforts to build a fair and comprehensive system for workers injured on the job. Steve organized injured worker self-help groups both locally in Thunder Bay, then regionally in Western Ontario by co-founding the Ontario Network of Injured Workers Groups and nationally by co-founding the Canadian Injured Worker Alliance. Thank you, Steve, and over to you to introduce our panelists and session topic.
Thanks so much, Emma, and welcome everybody to our session today. Our session today is Worker Well-Being and the Gig Economy. We'll have 2 presentations, each about 20 minutes long. We'll follow that by a discussion that I'll moderate between our 2 presenters, and then we'll have questions from you. And we really encourage you to ask questions, put comments into that chat function, and then we'll be able to grab them and direct them to either Deborah or Arif, depending on, or both, if you choose one or the other of our presenters to ask your question to. It is my great pleasure to welcome Arif Jetta. Arif is an assistant professor at the Dalla School of Public Health, the University of Toronto, and he's a scientist at the Institute for Work and Health. His research spans population health, systems science, and social policy to examine how the future of work affects vulnerable workers. He earned his PhD from the University of Toronto and holds a Master's of Science from the London School of Economics and Political Science. He was a recent recipient of the 6-year STARS Early Career Salary Award from the Arthritis Society, and he holds multiple Tri-Council grants as the principal investigator. He's a mixed methodologist and has experience leading interdisciplinary research and partnership teams. And I'd also like to introduce our second panelist, Dr. Deborah Steenstris. I think I got it right, I'm not sure. Deborah holds the Janslowski Chair in Families and Work at the University of Guelph. where she is the director of Live, Work Well Research Center and professor of political science. She's also the author of About Canada, Disability Rights. Her research and publications explore the intersection of disabilities, gender, childhood, and Indigenousness, leads a team, identifying barriers to and as well as possibilities for engagement and transformation of change. She leads a team exploring disability and livelihoods in Canada. Her work also contributes to comparative and trans-international research and theory related to intersectional disability rights and justice. Welcome to our panelists, and over to you, Arif.
Thanks, Steve. It's always a pleasure to be introduced by you and to work with you, and to work with Deborah as well. So I'm really excited to deliver this talk today. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen, and I hope this works because there's always challenges. Okay, so it starts at slide 5. Okay, so if folks can see my screen, can you give me a thumbs up, Steve?
We can see your screen.
Excellent, thank you so much. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to be presenting on research that I'm leading on the future of work. And as noted, this presentation is going to focus specifically on the role of the future of work as it relates to changing work arrangements and the growth in the gig economy that could emerge as a result of the various trends that characterize the future of work. Before I start, I'd like to acknowledge the land on which the Institute for Work and Health, my home institution, operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron, Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this land is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to conduct our work on it. Just briefly, for those who are unaware, the Institute for Work and Health is a not-for-profit academic research organization based in Toronto, and we conduct and share research to protect and improve the health of working people. And our research is carried out in 2 broad domains. The first is the prevention of work-related injury and illness, and the second is through the improvement of health and recovery of workers experiencing injury or disability. And we do a lot of KTE work, meaning that we try to get our evidence into the hands of decision makers. So you'll hear this concept, future of work, quite a bit. Obviously, this symposia is focused on the future of work, but it's a concept that gets talked about in the media quite a bit. When I talk about the future of work, I define it as the large scale and rapid digitization and automation of diverse domains of working life. It's not only about technology though, the future of work can also be coupled with social, demographic, political, as well as environmental changes. And the reason why the future of work is being talked about quite a bit is because it reflects a dramatic change to every industry and the transformation of all aspects of our working life, including where we work, how we work, and the types of jobs that just generally exist. It's also important to note that the future of work is superimposed on top of ongoing industrial shifts, like the movement from manufacturing to more knowledge-based settings, the offshoring of work, and, as we focus on in this presentation, the growth in non-standard work arrangements. And so it's important to highlight that there's been a ton of research on this topic, both internationally and locally, where organizations and academics have been studying different aspects for the future of work over the last decade. And it's really paved the way in our understanding of potential changes to our working world. But what's often missing from these studies is the experiences of diverse groups of workers, especially those who may experience disadvantage within the labor market. Also, existing research on the future of work does not acknowledge the health and social inequities that can be associated with potential changes to the nature of work. And these are gaps that our team at the Institute for Work and Health really is aiming at filling. In particular, the context of the future of work, I really focus on people living with disabilities who represent a sizable proportion of the Canadian working population and often face labor market exclusion. And so as part of this presentation, as we move forward, I'll present some qualitative data on the perceptions held by young people living with disabilities regarding the future of work. So on this slide, there's a graph, but I'm not going to really focus too much on the graph. Rather, I'll explain it a little bit more just to bring it to light. And this graph kind of highlights one of the key reasons to study the future of work, and that is that new occupations are constantly being created. So in 2020, economists at MIT conducted an analysis of different occupational titles that existed in the 1940s, and then compared them to different occupations that existed in 2018. And what they found was that 60% of occupations held by employees in 2018 did not exist in the 1940s. These are brand new occupations with evolving working conditions and work arrangements. And so the authors highlight the emergence of technology-related occupations like IT specialists or biomedical engineers, but they also highlight the growth in in-person service jobs like mental health counselors, sommeliers, or fitness coaches. And this represented another category of occupations that emerged. So indeed, technology has played a significant part in the growth of these new occupations, but the authors also point to increased globalization, which has resulted in a decline in jobs in agricultural and manufacturing settings. Also, a rise in wages has meant that people have more money to spend in the service-based economy. And so to me, this study is important because it really brings to light the ever-evolving nature or changing nature of our working world and the fact that things will continue to evolve. And if we look at this data 20 years in the future, I'm sure a brand new suite of occupations will definitely characterize the labor market. So another point and kind of relevant to this discussion is that evolving workforce conditions will obviously have implications for the health and well-being of the working population. Yet, as noted, the future of work has primarily been studied by economists or labor market specialists, and less by public health or occupational health researchers. And so decades of research show that being employed, the quality of work, and the working conditions which a person is exposed to either directly or indirectly relates to their physical and mental health. Conversely, one's health may also determine their ability to participate in the labor market. And so the future of work has the potential to dramatically disrupt all aspects of the working world and, as a result, impact this work and health interface. And this is pretty critical to this discussion on gig work and worker well-being. Another aspect of the future of work, which remains in its infancy, is an understanding of its impact on groups of workers who have traditionally faced disadvantage. So drawing from scholarship at the Institute for Work and Health, we characterize vulnerable workers according to the conditions to which they are exposed. So this can include adverse or unsafe conditions at work, lacking access to employment legislation or statutory benefits, also lacking opportunities to actually improve your working conditions when they are not as good as you want them to be, earning lower wages or experiencing employment instability, for instance, in the gig economy. And some estimates suggest that up to 1/3 of Canadian workers experience some form of vulnerable working conditions. And while we don't want to paint a broad brush, population level data suggests that certain labor market subgroups are more likely to experience vulnerability, including women, visible minorities, the Indigenous population, LGBTQ+ individuals, people with disabilities. And these workers may also be those that are more likely to experience challenges as we realize the future of work. And so for this presentation, as noted, I'm going to focus on the implications of the future of work for people living with disabilities. And kind of to further contextualize this topic a little bit more, we can look to previous changes that have occurred in our labor market as a roadmap for how the future of work could impact the employment of vulnerable groups. For instance, past periods of technological change, as well as past periods of recession, have resulted in the displacement of jobs, have contributed to income polarization, as well as an erosion of standard and secure work opportunities. Past studies also show that groups experiencing vulnerable conditions like youth, people with disabilities were amongst the most affected during these past changes. What's more, studies during these periods have showed a decline in physical and mental health at the population level, further highlighting this work and health interface. More recently, the automation of work has had an adverse effect on vulnerable workers who might be more likely to work in jobs prone to displacement. And so I think what's important to highlight is, compared to past examples that I've just described, changes in the future of work are occurring at a faster pace and are disrupting a greater number of industries and occupations, highlighting the potential for more significant health and social inequities. So relevant to this presentation, and another trend we've observed prior to the pandemic, and that's kind of accelerated post-pandemic, is the growth of the gig economy and gig work. So when we refer to gig work, it's kind of talked about in different ways, and I've synthesized some of the kind of like the key characteristics of gig work. And that includes temporary or project-based employment, It's when a worker is hired on demand to complete a particular task for a certain period of time. Gig work often also encompasses microtasking, where jobs are parceled out and contracted to workers using digital platforms. And oftentimes, gig work can be synonymous with precarious forms of employment or a job insecurity. But it's important to highlight that while some workers can be disadvantaged by gig work, those in professional settings might actively choose to pursue gig types of jobs and pursue more flexible work contracts and might actually benefit from gig work, whereas other workers might be disadvantaged by gig work and may be forced into circumstances where they're working more precariously and where they are unable to control the levels of job insecurity that they may be facing. And so the proportion of workers in Canada that report working in the gig economy has increased, and data shows that from 2005 to 2016, the proportion of Canadians in the gig economy has increased from 5.5% to about 8.2%, which is a sizable proportion of the Canadian labor market. In 2018, up to 2/3 of Canadians earned a portion of their income through a digital platform. And I think what's important and something that we need to pay attention to is that the COVID-19 pandemic accelerated the platform economy by some reports suggesting 176%. So this is an issue that we need to pay attention to. And so as research at the Institute for Work and Health has evolved on this topic of future of work, we start to do some foundational research, and we start to ask ourselves, what evidence actually exists on the different trends that may span social, technological, economic, environmental, and political domains of our working lives and characterize the future of work? How do future of work trends impact vulnerability within the labor market, including employment in the gig economy? So to address these research questions, we recently completed a comprehensive horizon scan of gray and peer-reviewed research and social media to examine aspects of the future of work that could emerge and contribute to adverse conditions for workers. I thought I would briefly touch on some of these findings, which are published in the American Journal of Industrial Medicine. And so our team identified 9 key macro trends, again, ranging from technological, social, political, and environmental domains that characterize the future of work. Examples of trends included the digital transformation of the economy, the growing application of artificial intelligence to automate work, and climate change in the green economy. Of note, our study highlighted that these trends were interrelated and could individually as well as collectively contribute to vulnerability in the future of work. And so the horizon scan that I'm presenting right now provides a roadmap to understand how the future of work could create conditions that pose challenges for workers who have traditionally faced disadvantage and could force workers into more precarious forms of employment, including gig work. Given the time constraints of this talk, I'm only going to touch briefly on some of the few themes that emerged as we kind of pursued some of these topics in greater depth. And so based on the horizon scan and in discussions on the future of work, it's clear to see that technology will shape employment conditions as we move forward. A lot of attention has been directed towards the digital transformation of the economy as a significant driver of change. And so we often hear about diverse technology like the Internet of Things, smart sensors, cloud computing, virtual reality, augmented reality, 3D printing, robotics, blockchain technology. Also, there's been an increasing discussion on artificial intelligence and machine learning, with workplaces deploying computerized systems to replicate human intelligence and behaviors. And so while these technologies are all diverse in nature, they're resulting in a hyperconnectivity between people, businesses, digital devices, and data. The digital transformation of the economy is also rapidly changing the way jobs are performed and the requirement for humans to work alongside machines. One of the most significant themes that has emerged through our synthesis of evidence was that the digital transformation of the economy can create challenges for vulnerable workers. As noted, the advancement and use of digital platforms has facilitated gig work, which could be more precarious and stressful. Also, growing automation of work has meant that repetitive job tasks will continue to be replaced by machines. And we could think about self-checkout counters replacing cashier jobs. Over time, as artificial intelligence becomes more commonplace, it's expected that more complex and predictive job tasks may be automated. As a result, there could be competition for a limited number of entry-level as well as professional jobs. Also, there's a risk that available entry-level jobs will be those that pay less, have unpredictable physical demands, and could be more unsafe and could exacerbate disability. It's thought that these types of jobs could be more challenging to automate, and as a result, they could grow in prominence. And we can think about nursing aides in long-term care settings, who are often among the most disadvantaged workers and who are also forced into short-term gig-based contracts. At the same time, the evidence that we synthesized also found that technology could be associated with opportunities for vulnerable workers. Obviously, the advancement of different technologies will contribute to productivity gains and the development of new occupations. Different technologies could also be leveraged to create conditions that are more accessible. And this could include smart robots in manufacturing settings, which could enable a person to take on more cognitive demands while relying on a robot for more physical support. Digital technology could also provide a level of flexibility that could be beneficial for some groups of workers. Also, while the gig work in the platform economy can be seen in a negative light, for some workers could also open up economic opportunities and provide an entry point into the labor market. And furthermore, in a digitized world, workers with emotional intelligence, which may not be able to be replaced by a computer, can be in high demand by employers, and this could be beneficial for workers from diverse groups who have different lived experience. And again, it's important to highlight that the future of work is not just shaped by technology. In our Horizon scan, we found that climate change, globalization, and populist sentiments are also expected to change the nature and availability of work. Similarly, external shocks like a recession, a natural disaster, or as we've seen in this year, or the last few years, a pandemic, has the potential to disrupt employment and drastically change working conditions and contribute to an erosion of standard work arrangements. And consistent across these trends, we found that it's often the most vulnerable groups of workers who will be the first to be affected and more likely to face adverse conditions resulting from these trends. And so insights from the Horizon scan that I just presented on have provided us with a framework that we've used to inform more qualitative research that we've conducted at the Institute for Work and Health to explore experiences faced by vulnerable workers in a changing work environment. And so in the following sections, I'm just going to present briefly qualitative findings from a study of youth and young adults with disabilities. And this study is currently under peer review. And so we conducted semi-structured interviews on thoughts and perceptions held by young people with disabilities on the future of work. And we interviewed about 22 young people, 2/3 were women, and just over half were working full-time in their current job. And so one of the key themes that emerged from this data was that participants tended to note that finding a secure job was challenging, and that the jobs that were most available to young workers tended to be contingent in nature, including short-term contracts, gig work, freelancing, or microtasking. Participants did acknowledge that precarious forms of employment provided an entry point into the working world, which were seen by some as a positive. At the same time, precarious forms of employment were frequently described as a significant barrier to sustaining employment with a disability and obtaining needed accommodations. For instance, one participant with a physical disability described the implications of the gig economy for people living with disabilities. And they noted, a lot of times the gig economy is seen as a good thing, that maybe it'll actually include people with disabilities. I'm sure that's about reality too, but I think the gig economy could be quite dangerous for people with disabilities. The inclusion of people with disabilities, partly because right now accommodations are enshrined in employment legislation. So when you move into the gig economy, you are no longer an employee, you're a contractor. And so the nature of work arrangements as they relate to discussions on the future of work was an important theme that continued to emerge throughout our conversation with study participants. And so in describing the opportunities that can be related to the digital transformation of the economy, a lot of participants describe the role of technology in creating flexibility in the ways they performed work and where work is performed. Of note, those tending to describe the benefits of technology to people with disabilities tended to have more secure work arrangements. So those working in full-time jobs ended up having more positive perceptions of technology. On the other hand, those working precariously were more likely to report being disadvantaged by technology. For example, one participant working in a full-time white-collar job noted, if there's more advances in technology where people can have the same software they're using at work and be able to use that at home, I think it will give, especially for people with disabilities, more opportunities to have a job and keep a job. To ensure that opportunities associated with the digital transformation of the economy are realized, several participants indicated the importance of employer or policy level supports to ensure the inclusive design and application of digital technologies, especially in the platform economy. These participants noted that if employers maintain an eye towards accessibility, they could implement technology in ways that foster productivity and also ensure that people living with disabilities are not disproportionately disadvantaged. And this balance between productivity and inclusion was described nicely by one participant. And they noted, I think that technology can only do so much if those technological advances are not paired with structural and institutional attitudes of accessibility. When I look at technological advances, they seem to mostly prioritize an ethic of productivity. And so when it comes to disabled workers, technological advancement help business, and it also helps employers because now disabled workers can be just as productive as a non-disabled worker. And very lastly, despite the potential benefits associated with the digital transformation of the economy, there could be some negative effects. Participants working precariously were more likely to report that the use of digital technology would result in them being displaced from their employment. For instance, one participant working in a part-time temporary customer service job described the negative impact technology was having on their employment and their thoughts on the future. They noted, I don't think technology would be a good thing in my job because customers could interface with a computer screen and it tells them everything they want to know. What use are us to be there? We're dispensing information. The more technologically advanced things get, the less likely the employer will need us. And so in the just being conscious of time and knowing that I've just hit my 20-minute mark, I'm not going to really go into some of these discussion points that I have. Rather, maybe I can save them for our panel discussion that we have once Deborah finishes her presentation. But I think in general, it's important to highlight that standard work arrangements are going to become, non-standard work arrangements are going to become more commonplace. And we need to think about novel solutions and novel policies and novel programs to protect the most vulnerable workers, as well as create relevant social safety nets, as well as labor protections. And just a quick plug, if you're interested in this research and you want to learn more, please give me a shout. We're recruiting tons of people to inform the research and to partner with us. I'd also like to highlight our funders, the New Frontiers in Research Fund and the Arthritis Society, which funds my salary. We have a multidisciplinary research team from across Canada, the United States, and Europe. And here's my contact information, and feel free to reach out if you have more questions regarding this research or any other work at the Institute. So thank you so much, and I'll hand it over to Steve.
Thank you so much, Arif. I now have about 25 questions, and I want to really encourage all the audience and the participants, put your questions into the chat or comments, and hopefully we'll get to them. And thank you so much, Arif, and over to you, Deborah.
Thanks, Steve. And Emma, thank you for putting up my slides. So thanks to the Work Wellness Institute for this invitation. I'm really excited to discuss what I think is an important topic with Arif and Steve and you, the audience. I'm coming to you from the traditional lands of the Attawandaron peoples and the treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit. So what does it mean to me to acknowledge the keepers of the land that I'm on? To me, it is about recognizing some of the deepest power inequities that shape Canadian life and work, and working to ensure that these both are clearly evident in the work that I do and in the change that we advocate for and work for. And so that's in part how I approach this topic. Next slide, please. So to build on Arif's presentation, and we come at things differently, but we're really talking about similar things. I thought I'd talk a little bit about a recent webinar on workers in the gig economy that I attended and how that discussion helped to shape my thinking on what I present today. Then I'd like to introduce you to the Livelihoods Approach, which is a container to help us understand the context for how people make their decisions about the ways in which they can both survive and thrive. And I'd like to share some of the findings from a research study on livelihoods and young women with disabilities. And then I'll come back full circle to ask, what does this have to do with the gig economy and worker well-being? Next slide. So as RF noted, the gig economy really has to be understood in the context of the future of work. And I think he's done a great job in giving you a sense of what each of those means. In May, the Carleton University Work and Labor Program hosted a webinar on the gig economy with a couple of panelists, including Jennifer Scott from Gig Workers United. Jennifer offered a more focused understanding of the gig economy, reflecting her place as the president of Gig Workers United and one of the architects of the Gig Workers Bill of Rights. I encourage you to check out the recording of the seminar and the other links I've posted. Let me give you a brief summary of what was in that session and what may be useful for our conversation today. So Jennifer talked about gig workers as those who use their own vehicles to deliver things in an app-based economy. That's a much narrower version of what RF was talking about. The features of the gig economy for Jennifer were that costs and risks are being offloaded from the employers to both consumers and workers. She notes that the pitch for gig work is its flexibility, but the work itself is not flexible. It requires the workers to be flexible around the work for the app. This type of work, she says, requires working Friday and Saturday nights, which are the most lucrative. And for her, this is not flexibility. While the app companies pitch the flexibility of this work, they also argue that that flexibility means that these workers do not need the same protections as more traditional workers. Thus, Jennifer argues, and I quote her, "This is an intentional and well-planned move to change the terms for what work looks like." So when I raised the situation of disabled gig workers, Jennifer noted that the targeted work groups for taking on gig workers are very much those vulnerable workers that RF talked about. Folks, marginalized migrant workers, disabled workers, those who come from intergenerational poverty, those really who are on the margins of the current labor force. What she argues is that the apps rely on workers who have a harder time claiming their rights, including the rights to occupational health and safety, other job protections, workers' compensation when they are injured on the job. To use a different language, I think that gig work is targeted to people who are trying to survive, but pitched as something that will help people live a better life. It is targeted to people who feel they have few options and many barriers, and who have been consistently marginalized in the existing labor force. And that leads me to the Livelihoods Framework or Approach. Next slide, please. So what are livelihoods? Well, generally, they are the means by which we make a living and a life. They can be individual, but they're shaped by families and communities, as well as our sense of well-being. Livelihoods includes work and employment, and oh, so much more, including market gardening, the arts, bartering, informal recycling, care providing, volunteering, and so on. Next slide. A livelihoods approach is something that was developed to understand how people living in poverty in the global South contributed to their communities and what shaped their choices. It has not often been used to understand how people in the global North, like Canada, survive and thrive. A livelihoods approach brings into view the multiple forces that influence the options people perceive they have and the choices they make. These forces can facilitate or hinder paths to livelihoods and can act together in cascading or cumulative ways to affect the livelihoods of certain groups of people more intensely. And they may include power relations, policies, institutions, processes, and unexpected situations or crises like COVID. The image on the screen illustrates different aspects of a livelihoods approach. The first box on the far left is the goals. What do people hope to do to survive and thrive? The second is their perception of what is possible. What options do they think they have? The third is what choices or strategies strategies do they use around their livelihoods? And finally, on the right, what are their livelihood activities? What do they actually do to survive and thrive? So we use a livelihoods approach together with intersectionality. Together, these bring to attention the ways in which lived experiences of diverse people are shaped by multiple aspects of life, including things like ableism, racism, heterosexism, capitalism, and colonialism. Next slide, please. This image includes the same parts of a livelihoods approach in a circle, noting two key questions. Why do people with disabilities do what they do? And what do people with disabilities do to survive and thrive? Next slide. So let me share with you how we've been using this livelihoods approach in research with young women with disabilities in Canada. Our overall project is funded by a Social Sciences and Humanities Council of Canada partnership development grant called Disability and Livelihoods in Canada. We work in 3 pilot studies related to volunteering, the arts, and pre-employment supports. The findings today come from our pilot research, a partnership with the Canadian Council for Rehabilitation and Work, or CCRW, and Disabled Women's Network of Canada, DAWN Canada. And it examines the livelihoods of young women with disabilities who are involved in Youth the Future project, which is a pre-employment support program. I'd like to acknowledge the work of Valérie Grandmaison and Catherine Renders in this project. We conducted a policy analysis and key informant interviews to understand how current policies and programs consider different types of livelihoods for diverse women with disabilities and how they address supports and barriers to livelihoods. We also conducted focus groups in French and English and a survey with current and former young women with disabilities involved in YTF to explore how they meet their needs, thrive, and make decisions about their lives. We engaged in collaborative data analysis to develop a self-advocacy tool for diverse young women with disabilities and briefs to inform policy and program implementation that supports their livelihoods, in addition, of course, to academic publications. So I'm going to focus on the survey reports today, results today. Next slide, please. Let me give you a little background around why and how we did our survey. Our initial intent in this pilot project was to focus our learning on the learning from and with young women with disabilities in Montreal, who were part of the only women-only site of Youth the Future, which is organized through the CCRW. DAWN Canada co-hosts that site. In March 2020, we held 2 focus groups and were poised to return for the 3rd group in the 3rd week of March when you know what happened, COVID, and the world shut down. Over the next year and a half, we tried everything to reach participants and engage them in our research, online focus groups, linked yoga classes, but they were not interested or they were not able to engage virtually on the issues that we were raising. So we had to rethink our research design. With our partners, we decided to try and reach all the women within the last few years in any of the cohorts of Youth the Future across Canada. It was much later in the pandemic, and we used CCRW's SurveyMonkey tool and asked CCRW to reach potential participants. We were much more successful and had 30 young women who answered the survey. The survey included a series of demographic questions, quantitative questions, and qualitative questions. We also included questions related to the findings from the focus groups to see if the issues raised earlier resonated with this much wider group of young women. The survey was long as far as surveys go, and there was a gift card incentive for completing it. So who completed it? I've outlined some key aspects on the screen. Most identified as women, although some said they were non-binary. Almost a third identified as Black or a racialized minority, although none identified as Indigenous. And this is significant on both accounts. Over 1/3 identified as LGBTQ2S, Most lived in urban or suburban areas, and about 18% had experienced living in an institutional setting. The participants identified a whole range of impairments and disabilities that they lived with. Learning disabilities and mental health disabilities had the highest proportions. Next slide, please. So the next few slides illustrate the participants' response to some key questions about their livelihoods. This slide illustrates their answers to the question, how do you meet your needs? And they could identify all that applied. By far, the largest number, over 60%, identified support from family and friends. Government assistance is identified by about a quarter of the participants. Full-time employment is identified by 15%, while part-time employment about 22%. There are a few other interesting choices in this chart, including creating art at 15%. This slide also reflects or replicates what we know from Statistics Canada data, which is that women with disabilities have a modest relationship to the paid workforce, and that part-time work is often the employment they have. What we learned by asking more generally about meeting needs is the significant role that family and friends play. This can be financial support, emotional support, housing support, and other caring supports. We also see that creating art is an important way of meeting needs for these women. Next slide. We wanted to shift from thinking only about survival to what helped people to thrive. Therefore, we asked question 10. From the choices you selected in question 8, which ones bring you the most joy or are the most meaningful? We see again that support from family and friends is by far the highest at bringing joy at 63%. Both full and part-time employment were ranked as being meaningful for 22% of participants. Interestingly, creating art came in much higher than employment at 33%. And we see new categories of finding meaning and joy in gardening and volunteering, both at 18.5%. Next slide. With these understandings of meeting needs and finding meaning, we ask specifically, what does living well mean for you? I think that's not the right slide. Is that slide 11? Okay. No, back, one more back. One more. Oh, there's a slide missing. Okay, well, let's go to slide 11, whatever it is. So we asked specifically, what does living well mean for you? And some of the responses were being able to live a stable life with a stable job, taking care of well-being. This replicates what Arif was saying in his presentation. Staying socially active, laughing often, being financially secure enough to live beyond paycheck to paycheck, being able to create a safety net, exploring my creativity, creating meaningful art, and having a full or part-time job and being able to pay for my bills and having food on the table. You'll notice that paid work is important, but not sufficient for living well. Participants included food security, well-being, social activity, and stability in life, including housing and creativity and relationships. So then we said, in question 14, what are the types of supports do you need to make a living or live well? Again, some of these might surprise you. They did me. They do include traditional supports like accessibility, accommodations, mentoring, and coaching. But they also reflect a much broader notion of supports, family and friends, doing something I love, and helping others. These were much higher than the traditional sources of support. Next slide. Oh, again, something's missing here. Since we are doing this in COVID times, we asked what additional supports people required to meet their needs during the pandemic. Mental health supports were by far the highest at 68%. Financial supports at 44%. Food delivery and using more taxes all reflect what we learned from various COVID research around the experiences of people with disabilities during the pandemic. But they also reflect the additional challenges to living well and meeting needs at times of crises like the pandemic. So let's come back to the gig economy and the questions of the livelihood analysis that I mentioned earlier. These questions were, why do people with disabilities choose or not choose gig work? What are people doing to survive and thrive in this changing work environment? And what are the implications of our answer for these actions? So what we know is, could you go to the next slide? We're not using this slide. Okay, and the next one after that. Thanks. No, next one after that. And the next one. Okay, there we are. Now we're in sync. So we know that gig work has a number of livelihoods implications, including accessibility barriers in apps, lack of workplace protections, the requirements for working flexibly may not be possible for those with particular conditions or impairments, or with caregiving responsibilities. Isolation may be reinforced, as well with the various calculations about which hours are paid. The struggle to get enough hours or paid work may not support survival, let alone thriving. Next slide. So if the livelihood choice of people with disabilities is gig work, what other considerations or actions are needed? Clearly, the accessibility barriers need to be addressed. The fight for workplace protections, including the rights to be identified as a worker with standard benefits like access to EI, workers' compensation, etc., is key and needs to be done with collective strength. The Gig Workers' Bill of Rights sets out some of the key areas to fight for. But I think disability organizations and employers need to really think about what type of job placements are done and ensure that they address an awareness of what gig work is and what gig work isn't. And so some disability organizations in consultation with employers may want to think about a campaign about gig work and people with disabilities. Disability organizations could also ensure with employers that the placements that they provide are accessible, sustainable, and offer long-term prospects for people with disabilities. Next slide. So I hope that we can engage in a discussion that addresses livelihoods, not only work, and think about what is needed to both survive and thrive. As I said earlier, our participants suggest that paid work is important, but not sufficient. In these conversations, we need to address areas that are often in their own silos and not part of discussions about work. So reframing our conversations about livelihood helps us to include caring work instead of having to have separate conversations about the caring economy. It includes conversations about work, about volunteering, creative work, mental health supports, food security, and housing. As one of our participants noted, they want to have options, and that can require a job. I don't want to be a burden, says one participant. I never want to get to be a burden, but at the same time, if I can't get a job, what options do I have? Next slide. To end my comments today, I'd like to remind us of the importance of living well and what that means. Two participants offered their comments on what living well looks like. You'll see it includes relationships with humans and creatures, a recognition of capacity and the ability to contribute, and a need to be engaged and participate fully in their communities. Let me read you what they said. I have 3 human beings, my mom, my dad, and my brother, and 2 feline fur babies at home who don't judge me for who I am, who don't put limits on me, and who tell me I am capable. And the last one, being engaged in society. It opens a lot of doors for us. Social engagement. It makes me thrive a lot. Next slide. Thank you. And I've put up, I look forward to our conversations today, and I've put up my email address and a link to the Live Work Well site. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Deborah. I am so stimulated here because what I hear from the two of you is that there's kind of a disconnect between our mainstream discourse about the future of work and all the benefits it's going to give us in terms of flexibility and geez, you can go here, you can do that. It doesn't matter if you have a disability or not. And the reality of people with disabilities in terms of how they experience it. So I want to start off, Arif, really with your comment about who is it that is really focusing on the future of work. And you really talked about economists as being the people we're kind of relying on. And they don't oftentimes take into account some of these other social and health related factors. Is that right? And what can we do if they're not seeing what real life is like for vulnerable people and people with disabilities?
Yeah, so first and foremost, I was told that my microphone was cutting off at times during my presentation. So to everyone on the webinar, I apologize for that. And if you have any questions about anything that you missed out on because of my tech gaps, please send me an email. Steve, to your point, yeah, I think this is a big an important conversation that we all need to really pay attention to. So I think based on my observations, studies or research or commentary on the future of work often takes a more business directed perspective. And that's because things are changing so rapidly that employers are worried that they won't have the labor market or the labor force that's skilled enough to meet the demands of their changing working world. They won't have individuals who have the technological skills to work with really complex technologies. They might not have the social skills that are required to meet the service-based demands or work alongside intelligent machines. That's a really legitimate concern, and it's an important one as our labor market changes. And I think now what the next step in this discourse is that individuals like myself and Deborah need to step in and say, well, like, we need to make sure that every program, policy, social support that gets built off this discourse on the future of work makes sure that those who are most disadvantaged or who have traditionally been disadvantaged are accounted for in this discussion. So as an example, a big conversation on the future of work is on job skilling. And there's a number of new job skills programs that aim at upskilling workers or reskilling workers to make sure that they're able to pivot in terms of their abilities to meet employer demands. Now, if these programs aren't tailored to the unique needs of people with disabilities, racialized groups, newcomers to Canada, then they're only going to benefit a small segment of the population, and they're going to exclude another segment of the population. That's going to exacerbate inequities in our working world. And that's kind of what we need to think about and try to avoid. And just before I hand it over to maybe Deborah to respond to this, I think one of the biggest outcomes of COVID, or what we've seen amidst this like reopening of the economy, is like massive labor shortages. Employers, policymakers need to take steps to incorporate those who have been traditionally excluded back into the economy. And that could really bridge this labor shortage that exists. And it could be beneficial from a worker well-being perspective, because a lot of individuals who are excluded then face a number of health and social outcomes that can result from their employment circumstances.
Thanks so much, Arif. Deborah, now, this disconnect, I wonder how broad it is. I mean, you talked about even connecting with the young women to get them to fill out the surveys. And I'm linking it to, the election we just had in Ontario, where we had the lowest turnout ever. Only 43% of the folks eligible to vote took the time to vote. Are people kind of going, this disconnect in terms of the public discourse is leaving me behind, and where do I go with it? What's your perspective on that?
What I think we learned, we kept in fairly close touch with our partners at CCRW and On Canada, who were working with the young women throughout the pandemic and before. And what they told us pretty clearly is that so many of these young women have complicated life circumstances. with responsibilities for children or for parents, including, accessibility challenges and barriers and things like this. And for them to add in additional online events was not going to be possible. Like, they didn't have the time or the emotional capacity or the logistic capacity to figure out how to get access to the internet for the period of time. So my thinking about the disconnect is going the same direction RF is, except I don't start or stop just at work, because I think that when we do that, we get into the same cycle. Work is about what employers need. It's not about what employees or workers need. And the minute we start with what employers need, without thinking through how are we going to support our labor force to be able to pick up the work that employers need, we're going to run into the same problem. So I've been tracking on Twitter today a parallel conversation about care and work. And it seems to me we have these great discussions about the caring economy, but we don't bring them into these conversations about employment or about worker well-being in these conversations about disabled people, because we don't think about disabled people as care providers. We think about them always as care recipients. And so for me, the disconnect comes in because we don't treat people with disabilities as whole human beings, right? We don't understand that they have full, complete, complicated lives, and that shapes how they come into wanting to survive and thrive.
I'm wondering too about what we know about the impacts on our health of the gig work and precarious work. Some of the big studies that have documented how work can affect our health significantly, like the Whitehall study, are done with big organizations, secure employment over a long period of time. And they show that when there's a balance for the worker between their responsibility and the amount of control they have over their work, they're healthier. And when that is out of balance, their health declines. Now, what I hear with the gig economy, it's not giving people that flexibility. It's demanding a certain amount of where you can participate, when you can participate, and your control starts getting undermined. What do we know about this? Does this really affect people's health and well-being?
I can start, and then Deborah, I'll hand it over to you. Yeah, 100%. It's definitely related to individuals, both physical and maybe more specifically their mental health. And we started to see this in 2008 after the Great Recession, where work became more precarious, standard work arrangements started to erode, and there was a growth in more non-standard work. And this is kind of like, many believe that the modern form of gig work in the platform economy kind of emerged during this period. And I think a lot of studies, especially of young people during this period of time, highlight considerable changes to mental health, rising depression and anxiety, and a significant amount of that was related to their working circumstances, their abilities to find jobs amidst an economic downturn, their ability to find stable employment and earn a living that allowed them to feel like they could support themselves and then kind of advance within their personal and their working life. And I can't cite studies off the top of my head, but my instinct is, within this COVID-19 environment, which is stressful in itself, if you add insecure employment, low income or unstable income sources, that in itself is going to exacerbate the level of stress you see. And so many of these Whitehall studies, which talked about the relationship between stress at work and health outside of work, to me, that relationship not only gets strengthened, but it also becomes more variable. It creates a lot more unpredictability for the worker. And I think, to me, this is one of the most significant health threats that face our newest generation of workers. This is instability in income and their ability to sustain themselves outside of work.
Yeah, and I agree, Arif. And I think that we need to think about what I think burnout is a real thing. It's both emotional and mental, requiring emotional and mental health supports, but it is also about living with doable work, sustainable work, right? I live with chronic fatigue syndrome, and that means that I don't do so well later in the day. Like my words start slowing down, my mental processes start petering out. So if you ask me at 5 o'clock to finish a major piece of work, it's just not going to happen. And I have enough power and ability and control in my work life to be able to and I have a university that has a disconnect policy. So I have lots of protections that allow me not to have to make an individual accommodation. But I use this as an example, not to put the attention on me, but to illustrate that things like the condition that I live with can work if I have flexibility. So, if I can upload my work to the morning when I have lots of energy and when my mind is clear and I'm not, I haven't had too much stimulus, I'm really effective. But if you're demanding things of me late in the day, you're going to get what's possible. And so it's about these workplaces that recognize that human beings have a lot of diversity in who we are and how we both process information, how we do our work. And not all of that requires formal accommodations. What they require are inclusive, respectful workplaces that seek to let the worker do the best they can for the job that they're working as they are, right? Like to contribute as they are, rather than according to some abstract notion.
Deborah, I feel like you've just addressed, at least in part, a question we just got in on the chat. The question was, with the gig work economy growing, is there a way you can see accessibility barriers to actually be addressed through gig work, or even becoming a positive worker experience? What would that look like? Is there anything further you wanted to kind of build on that one? Either one of you.
Go ahead, Arif. I need a bit of moment to think.
Sure. So I think Deborah actually kind of brought this to life really nicely in her presentation, which talked about the fact that many employers will suggest that platform work and the gig economy provides a level of flexibility to someone's working life and provides a level of control that many people desire. And that could be true. I think there's, to some degree, you do have some autonomy on when you turn on the app, when you take on contracts. And for some professionals, gig work is the work arrangement of choice, and that's completely under their power. I think where things become more challenging is when a person is forced into gig work as a last resort because they are unable to find full-time secure employment with an employer that might offer accommodations. And this is not just for people with disabilities. This is for any person who is looking for work. I think the fear and the challenge arises is that because of the structure and the economic situation that's kind of built up in the platform economy, many employers don't have responsibilities to then accommodate their workers, to provide them with supports, health benefits, which many people, especially those with disabilities, require. So I think that being said, there's probably steps that technology companies can take to ensure that those who are working for them, the contractors that are being given the contracts to conduct work, that they can be supported. it's also a policy decision and a policy approach that can be taken. And I know in many industrialized contexts, new and more policies are being implemented that are supporting gig workers, but are they sufficient? Many would argue no. And I think there's more work that needs to be done to ensure that there's enough supports for workers who are either pushed into the gig economy or are choosing to be in the gig economy, but are facing challenges as a result of it.
And I think, as I said, Jennifer Scott from Gig Workers United talked about how important this big gig workers Bill of Rights is, and the recognition of gig workers as workers first and foremost. And the minute you shift to thinking of them as contractors, you change it from a level playing field to a stepped, right, like one with cobblestones or whatever, where you can easily trip. And so I think it's important to ensure that work is work, and that work protections are there. That I'd also, in terms of thinking about accessibility and standards, I think the new Accessibility Standards Canada that is creating and implementing accessibility standards across Canada through the Accessible Canada Act and equivalent ones in different provinces, has an obligation to think through what are accessibility standards in employment, including in non-traditional or non-standard work arrangements. And so I'd offer them the challenge to think through that as well.
So in order to achieve that outcome, you've both talked really about or mentioned kind of the disconnect between these two visions of the future of work. And Deborah, you really talked about how people with disabilities or their organizations need to have a larger role in this discourse. How can we promote that? How can we get these different points of view on the public policy agenda to address these challenges? We just only have a minute or two left.
I have two quick points. The first is to ensure that every time we talk about employment, we also talk about livelihoods. And so we shift the conversation to something broader and more inclusive. The second is, I'm going to forget it. So maybe you can move on to Arif, and if I remember it, I'll come back.
Yeah. 30 seconds, Arif.
30 seconds. I think within this kind of new post-pandemic, amidst this reopening of the economy and amidst labor shortages, I think we can make an argument to employers and policymakers who in the past might have maybe excluded certain worker groups to make that argument that there is a subset of the economy that is excluded, that wants to work, that's able to work, but requires support, even if they are in non-standard employment arrangements. And like Deborah said, there's a responsibility that policymakers and employers should have in order to make that a reality.
You know, I wish we had more time. We're out of time. I'm so stimulated by the work that both of you have done. Thank you so much for participating and sharing in this. You know, my sense as a person with a disability is we're like the canary in the coal mine. Like, we're the ones who have a bit more vulnerability that are the first ones going to be negatively affected by some of the changes. And I think that, and we're seeing with the increase in mental illness and mental health challenges, all workers are going to experience the same things. We just may be getting them a little bit sooner. So once again, people with disabilities are out front and number one. Emma, over to you.
Thank you, everyone, for such a fantastic discussion. And Steve, Deborah, Arif, it was very insightful, really appreciate it here. And as we've reached our time again for this session, I will leave everyone with a few closing notes and next steps. So first off, again, the presentation was recorded and it will be posted for free on our website along with the slides. If you're interested in receiving a certificate of attendance, please navigate to that accreditation opportunities in the menu. By purchasing all 3 panel certificates today, you will receive an annual WWI membership, which will guarantee unlimited certificates for e-courses, webinars, and more. And organizational and individual WWI members, you will receive a free certificate. Our next session, The Impact of Technology on Worker Wellbeing, will begin at 12:30 Pacific Standard Time, so just in about 30 minutes. And if you enjoyed that meditation from our first break, I have good news for you. We have another one in the lunch break. And again, I encourage you to explore the exhibitor hall, connect under networking, and stop by the showcase gallery for current research posters and projects on the future of work and well-being, as well as see any updates from that live graphic recording. I have seen the first one from the first session, and it is looking really amazing. When the session finishes, you will see a QR code pop up on your screen, and my colleague, Sophia Lee, will put a link in the chat. And if you feel like adding your key takeaways from this session to our word cloud, we would really appreciate what you have taken away. But most importantly, before you leave this page, please remember to fill out our session survey, which is linked in the description. Thank you again, everyone, and I look forward to seeing you at 12:30 Pacific Standard Time.